as we now move into our keynote, I would just like to do a brief introduction. Our keynote speaker for this conference is Director Alan Packwood of the Churchill Archive Center. Let me tell you a little bit about the Archive Center. I worked in and out of the Archive Center really since 2005 when I was doing my master's. The Archive Center is a remarkable place. If you've ever been there, you'll know why. It's like a presidential library, but it's sort of bigger than that, because it has not just the papers of Winston Churchill, but three other prime ministers, including Margaret Thatcher, Gordon Brown, and John Major. In addition to that, there are numerous collections of the people who I guess Jock Colville would call Churchillian, including Colville's own papers, as well as numerous scientists, because of course Churchill College is a science college and was supposed to be the answer or Britain's answer to MIT after the Second World War. And so Alan is the director of this remarkable place of study. So it's a tremendous honor to have him to come here today. And I also just want to say personally, Alan's a great friend of mine. A little bit about Alan Packwood, the man. He helped me tremendously get to where I'm at, and I have nothing but thanks and gratitude towards him. And so I'd like everyone to put their hands together for Alan Packwood.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Well, Warren, thank you very much for those kind remarks. Of course, I'm going to claim the right of retaliation straight away. We have known one another for over 20 years, or about 20 years now. And I know that everyone in this audience is going to agree with me when I say that Warren is a great guy. And actually that we all owe a huge debt to him and his team for bringing us together and for putting on this wonderful conference. I'm particularly grateful to his colleague Jamie, who put up with me repeatedly changing the flight that I wanted to get on to get me here. Okay, so for me, it's wonderful to be back in Knoxville and among so many friendly faces. I'm hugely grateful to Sherry Lee for hosting me. And on a professional level, the Churchill Archive Centre has worked closely with Knoxville in the past, staging events with the Howard Baker Centre, both here and in Cambridge. And I've become acutely aware that Knoxville's reach is a very powerful one. It was through Howard Baker that I was privileged to meet Henry Kissinger and Senator Warner. It was Alan Lowe, who's here today, who introduced me to President G.W. Bush. And more recently, and perhaps more bizarrely, while cruising the Irish Sea, I bumped into the political correspondent of your Knoxville Sentinel, Georgiana Vines, who I think is also here today, and who took this picture of me speaking on that cruise ship. So Tennessee and Knoxville, as this conference proves, contributed hugely to Allied success in the Second World War. I found it fascinating to listen to Jack Neely yesterday describing the various ways Oak Ridge, aluminum manufacturing, and production of clothing, the various ways in which Knoxville was supporting the war effort. I was also very amused when he reported the comment of one observer that made it the ugliest town in the United States. And that put me in mind of a Churchill quote, which I think is the best rebuff to that. So this is Churchill in 1929. He was on a tour of Canada, and I think they were in Calgary, and his son Randolph said that there were no cultured people in the town. And Churchill's response to that was to say, cultured people are just the glittering scum that float on a vast ocean of production. And that's the role that Knoxville was playing, the vast ocean, vast river of production. Okay, so My main subject today, D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944, Operation Overlord, the long-awaited liberation of France and the opening of a new front in northwestern Europe that ultimately spelt doom for Hitler's Reich. Here, undoubtedly, was a defining moment in the Second World War, one that's now associated in the popular consciousness with images of American troops, American GIs, storming ashore, as depicted, of course, in the dramatic opening sequence of the Hollywood blockbuster Saving Private Ryan. Now, Winston Churchill loved the movies, and I think on the whole he would probably have liked this movie, although you suspect he would have wanted more British and Canadian troops in it. He did visit Hollywood in 1929 on that same trip when he visited Calgary, where he met, amongst many others, Charlie Chaplin. And he described Chaplin as Bolshi, meaning Bolshevik or communist in politics, delightful in conversation. And they struck up a bit of a friendship, and this is Charlie Chaplin visiting Churchill at Chartwell a couple of years later. And this, of course, is what Chaplin looked like without the makeup and the screen makeup on. So Churchill really enjoyed his visits to Hollywood. He enjoyed his films. He would often show a film after dinner, even during the Second World War. And one of his favourites was this film, That Hamilton Woman, with real-life couple Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh playing Admiral Nelson and Lady Hamilton. Part love story, part wartime morale booster, it never failed to move the Prime Minister to tears. And we know, for example, that he watched it for a 5th time while at sea on board HMS Prince of Wales in August 1941, while steaming across the Atlantic for his secret rendezvous with President Roosevelt off the Newfoundland coast, the meeting that led to the Atlantic Charter Declaration. But there was one movie which came out in 2017 that I'm pretty certain Churchill would not have liked. And it was this one. Some of you may have seen it. Churchill, starring Brian Cox and Miranda Richardson as Winston and Clementine, so an all-star cast. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's set in the first days of June 1944, just before D-Day. And it opens with the British Prime Minister as a lonely figure walking on a beach and recoiling, as in his mind's eye, the waves run red with blood. And from there, the script, the movie, chooses to portray him as a gibbering wreck in the 48 hours before D-Day, anxious to persuade the military commanders not to risk all on this hazardous operation, which is bringing back to him memories of the Dardanelles, and taking to his bed when no one will heed his warnings. So, how accurate is that portrayal? Well, its origins can be traced back to General Eisenhower and Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe, which was published in 1948. It's a book that's generally very pro-Churchill, but Eisenhower does report that Winston feared the seas would run red with blood. And Ike also claimed that the British leader was a late convert to Overlord, reporting that Churchill had announced at a military conference as late as the 15th of May 1944 that he was hardening towards this enterprise, which of course suggested to Eisenhower and the Americans that he'd been rather soft on it up until that date. Now, it's certainly true that the First World War, the war of 1914 to 18, had exerted a profound impact on Churchill's life and on his thinking. Friends had been lost, his career had been almost destroyed, and his worldview challenged. The British Empire emerged from that conflict severely weakened, and the fabric of ordinary British life had been ripped apart, with war memorials to the local dead appearing in almost every village. And as wartime Prime Minister in the Second World War, Churchill certainly feared the cost of another bloody stalemate in Europe. And he later wrote, "The fearful price we had had to pay in human life and blood for the great offensives of the First World War was graven in my mind. and not to be blotted out by time or reflection. But there's another interrelated criticism of Churchill with regard to D-Day, namely that he didn't want to fight in France in 1944 because he was prioritising the defence of the British Empire. And of course, much has been written about his imperialism. Richard Toye, who you'll be hearing from in a moment, has written a book on Churchill's empire, which certainly touches on this. Churchill was a lifelong supporter of the British Empire, and in November 1942, he would famously assert that he had not become the King's First Minister, e.g. Prime Minister, to preside over its liquidation. His was a worldview built on a belief in the superiority of the Western democracies. And the allegation that has been made against Churchill is that he used his influence to lead his American allies away from Northern Europe, into the Mediterranean theatre, into Italy, and that he did so in an attempt to preserve the British Empire, allowing the Soviets to bear the brunt of the fighting against the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and that by doing so, he prolonged the conflict and with it the suffering of countless millions in Europe. So what I want to do in the few minutes allotted to me this afternoon is to show why, although there are elements of truth in this, I think that picture is too simplistic, and to explain why Overlord was such a hugely complex proposition and why, therefore, the Allies were perhaps right in not undertaking it until June 1944. And the first thing I would say is that we must remember that we see things in the rear-view mirror, with the benefit of hindsight. And with the benefit of hindsight, we know that D-Day was successful. We know that it led inexorably and fairly quickly to the end of the war in Europe. But hindsight was not a luxury that was afforded to Churchill, Roosevelt, and the other Allied leaders. To them, D-Day was a hugely complex operation and consequently a huge risk. And we mustn't forget that the need for D-Day was born from British weakness, not strength. Britain had been thrown out of Norway and then France by Hitler in 1940. We'd been thrown off the continent. And while Churchill still talked and immediately talked about returning, the British Army had clearly suffered a huge defeat at Dunkirk. And initially it could only contemplate commando raids of increasing scale against the continent. It was clear that it was going to take time to build up the relevant resources. Landings on a heavily defended enemy shoreline required specialist troops, equipment, training, and tactics. In fact, it took Soviet success on the Eastern Front and the arrival of the United States on the battlefield after Pearl Harbor before an invasion of France could seriously be contemplated. Churchill was fond of saying that the only thing worse than fighting with allies was fighting without them. By early 1942, he had not one but two powerful new allies, each coming to the top table with their own agendas and strategies for running and winning the war. The Russians, desperate for help in Eastern Europe, the Americans, keen to defeat Germany in Western Europe as quickly as possible so that they could turn against Japan in the Pacific. And the British and Americans had very quickly agreed on the Germany first strategy. President Roosevelt is keen to see US troops in action in Western Europe. But the detail was lacking. They discussed various operations in principle, but nothing had yet been decided. And it was at this moment, in April 1942, just a few months after Pearl Harbor, that this important letter is handed to Churchill. You can see there it's on White House paper, April the 3rd, 11 p.m. And it reads, "Dear Winston, what Harry and George Marshall will tell you about has my heart and mind in it. Your people and mine demand the establishment of a front to draw off pressure on the Russians. And these peoples are wise enough to see that the Russians are today killing more Germans and destroying more equipment than you and I put together. Even if full success is not obtained, the big objective will be." And it concludes down here, "Best of luck, make Harry, Hopkins, go to bed early and let him obey Dr. Fulton, US Navy, whom I'm sending with him as super nurse with full authority." So what I love about this letter, and of course at the bottom you've got, as ever, FDR. And what I love about this letter from President Roosevelt is the wonderful combination of grand strategy. This is what we need to do to win the war, with the very personal touch at the end. Because basically what Roosevelt is doing is telling Churchill not to keep Hopkins up drinking late. Because Hopkins's health, as many of you know, was notoriously bad. So the President's letter is designed to open discussions that will lead to the establishment of a new front in Western Europe. And it comes with a second document, a secret memorandum entitled Operations in Western Europe. And what you're looking at here is the original American military plan developed by Marshall and his protege General Eisenhower, delivered by Hopkins and endorsed by Roosevelt. The original military plan for the liberation of France. And this document could not have been clearer. The United States want a cross-channel operation, and they want it as quickly as possible. The language is unambiguous. One of the key phrases reads, "Western Europe is favoured as the theatre in which to stage the first major offensive by the United States and Great Britain. Through France passes our shortest route to Germany." So this plan proposes immediate cross-channel air operations and raids to allow troops to gain experience, accompanied by an intensive effort to create an invasion force in the UK, an invasion force that will include some 1 million American troops. Now this initial plan proposes seizing the beaches between Le Havre and Boulogne. But, and here's the big but, the plan also recognises that it's going to take time to build up the American forces in Britain. And it estimates the earliest date for D-Day as the 1st of April 1943. So this is April 1942. It's saying it's going to take at least a year to build up those forces to make a serious, large-scale attack against France. It's true that it does advocate a more limited operation to establish a smaller beachhead in France in the event of a Russian collapse on the Eastern Front, or perhaps more unlikely, a German disintegration. Now, the delivery of this letter and memorandum and the discussions that immediately follow mark the arrival of the Americans in the European theatre. And of course, this was something that Churchill had been hoping for, working towards since May 1940. So you would sort of assume that this would be music to his ears. After all, he's pledged himself very publicly to the restoration of France, the destruction of Nazism in Europe. But British weakness in 1942 means that he and the British Chiefs of Staff now favour a very different policy. Because although Churchill later wrote that after Pearl Harbor he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor was a disaster for Britain. It had only exacerbated British weakness. In the Pacific, the British had been relying on a strong American naval presence to deter and, if necessary, counter Japanese aggression. The loss of the American Pacific Fleet had left the British Empire in the East horribly exposed, and within weeks that had resulted in the loss of Hong Kong and the capitulation of Singapore, which was the largest surrender in the history of the British Army. And there was now a Japanese threat to the Indian Ocean and Australia. Worse still, the British are on the retreat again in North Africa, where Rommel is advancing towards Egypt. So early 1942 is a bleak time. And on the 2nd of July 1942, Churchill actually has to face a vote of confidence in his administration in the House of Commons. And during that debate, the Labour MP, Anurin Bevan, a long-term Churchill critic, makes the stinging rebuke that the Prime Minister wins debate after debate, but loses battle after battle. And it's true, at this time, from the British perspective, defeat is following defeat. And Churchill is faced with a dilemma. Having worked hard to create the American alliance, and ultimately knowing that he's dependent on American men and material for final victory, he can't risk alienating the President and General Marshall. He can't simply reject or ignore this plan. And so an elaborate game of diplomacy begins. And behind the scenes, Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff set about persuading, cajoling, and convincing their American counterparts that any return to France can only happen after the completion of their preferred operations in North Africa. And the Americans are initially very resistant to this, but logistical arguments are carefully deployed by Churchill. The obvious weakness in the US plan is that it is going to take time to build up those required American forces in Britain. In 1942, the United States are saying that they can only guarantee 3.5 divisions arriving in the UK. Now just think, when D-Day finally comes in June 1944, the initial assault is by 5 divisions, but within weeks there are more than 30 divisions deployed in France. So in the meantime, in 1942, the Americans are expecting the British to provide the majority of the troops, the naval support, and all the aerial protection for any operation. And Air Chief Marshal Portal makes it very clear in some of these key meetings that if the British RAF is responsible for major operations in France in 1942, it will be eaten up and destroyed within a matter of weeks. And the truth is, the British are completely overstretched at this point. And with all their existing commitments, they don't have the numbers, even for a limited operation in France. They don't have full control of the skies above the continent. And then Churchill points out to Roosevelt that there is a huge risk in being seen to do nothing or to do too little. If the American and British forces simply concentrate on building up their forces in Britain, preparing for a larger assault in 1943, this is going to offer no immediate support to the Russians, and it will see the Allies sitting idle in the west while the Red Army does all of the fighting in the east. And there's a real fear, of course, that the Russians will collapse. And this is also something that is deemed unacceptable by both Roosevelt and Churchill for public opinion in both Britain and the United States. So, an attack on French North Africa, Morocco and Algeria, is dangled as the best alternative. An invasion of Vichy-held and nominally neutral countries. If successful, it would relieve pressure on the British fighting in Egypt, opening up a new front against Rommel's forces in the desert. It will facilitate a decisive end to the North African campaign, and it will free up British forces for campaigning in France. It will also enable the Allies to practice amphibious operations and landings on a much less well-defended shoreline, where untried US troops are not going to go into conflict against veteran German units. The operation can also take place relatively quickly, and it will take place with overwhelming Allied naval and air superiority. So, in my view, it's these practical considerations that gradually tilt Roosevelt towards Churchill's preferred strategy. And that process is helped by continued British weakness in North Africa. Churchill is at the White House in June 1942 when Roosevelt hands him a note informing him that Tobruk has just fallen. And there's a dawning realization by the Americans, I think, that they cannot allow the British to lose in the Mediterranean because the consequences of that for their ally will be catastrophic. Then comes the ill-fated Dieppe raid of August 1942. This was the next step up in Churchill's strategy of escalating raids against the French shoreline. And the aim had been to capture and briefly hold the town of Dieppe on the French shoreline to test how easy it would be to gain that sort of foothold. And this operation goes extremely badly. The Canadian 2nd Division bears the brunt of the assault. There's a stronger than expected enemy presence, which when combined with poor communications between the British ground troops and their air and naval support, results in difficulties in landing the tanks and heavy armour and a failure to seize the key objectives. The Canadians are pinned down and they're badly mauled on the beaches. The tanks can't climb off the shingle beaches and get over the defences. Losses are extremely high and the town isn't taken. And this failed operation is a stark reminder of the difficulties of conducting such an amphibious assault. Seizing an enemy-held port, an enemy-held strongpoint by frontal assault is not going to be easy. General Alanbrooke, the chief of the British Imperial General Staff, head of the British Army, sees it as a lesson to the people who are clamouring for an invasion of France. And more recently, in the words of Professor Paul Kennedy, the psychological lesson of Dieppe was that when the Allies did come ashore in France, they were going to have to be very, very good. So it's easy to see why D-Day gets knocked back to 1943. Neither the British nor the Americans believe a large-scale assault is feasible, and a smaller operation is seen as too limited and too risky. But it's less obvious, perhaps, why the Allied invasion of France doesn't happen until June 1944. Now, the answer lies partly in the law of unintended consequences and in the natural momentum of war. Once you've launched Operation Torch, the assault against French North Africa, operations inevitably flow from it. You need to divert resources, troops into that theatre to support your operations there, and that further delays the build-up of forces in the United Kingdom. By January 1943 and the Casablanca Conference, the main steps on this long road to victory have been agreed. The Mediterranean will be the immediate priority, with Sicily the next target after the cleansing of North Africa to secure control over the Mediterranean. But at the same time, preparations will be stepped up for a larger entry into France in early 1944. Now that's a compromise, but the fact that President Roosevelt, Marshall and Eisenhower all ultimately agreed to it is, I think, a recognition that this was seen as the surest and safest way to victory at what they believed would be the lowest cost. Now, with hindsight and with our knowledge of the success of Overlord, it's a decision that has been and can be challenged. But I would argue that from the military perspective, there were clearly a number of preconditions that had to be met before any large-scale cross-channel operation could be launched. And I would summarise them like this. Before you can return to France, you've got to have a sophisticated level of British and American inter-service cooperation. You've got to have control of the seas, mastery of the air. You need a huge build-up of men and materials for an operation that is going to push on towards Paris and then Berlin. You need to ensure that your enemy is weakened and overstretched, and you need to know that you have got the technical equipment to get your troops safely ashore and to supply them. And you've got to know that those troops have the morale and the combat experience to actually deliver victory once they arrive in the theatre of operations. And I think it's worth looking at each one of these in turn to see how many of these preconditions could be met before the spring of 1944 and what role Churchill played in meeting them and making D-Day possible. So let's start with the sophisticated level of British and American inter-service cooperation. John Martin was Churchill's principal private secretary, and he accompanied his boss to Washington, D.C. in June 1942. Churchill's visit to Washington was not low-key. Presence of the British Prime Minister as a guest of the American President in the White House was well known. And it led to the arrival of this letter, postmarked from Denver, Colorado, and addressed to Winston Churchill, White House, Washington, D.C. And it fell to John Martin to open this letter. Once opened, its contents were even more succinct than the envelope. Just 2 anonymous typescript words on an otherwise blank sheet of paper. And those 2 words, go home. With the benefit of hindsight, much of what has been written about the wartime partnership between Britain and America has focused on its closeness, on what we've come to call the special relationship, a term that Churchill certainly promoted. And I think we tend to forget that these sentiments of brotherhood were far from universally shared on either side of the Atlantic in 1942. There were elements of American public opinion that were still fiercely isolationist and anti-British, just as there were elements in Britain that were pro-Russian and anti-American. So, from the top down, from the Prime Minister and the President, it took time to build the close political and military ties and develop the trust and teamwork that underpinned the alliance that made Overlord possible. The Anglo-American and inter-service cooperation, planning and staff work needed to make that assault against Hitler's fortress Europe was never going to be produced by desk clerks working in offices. It has to be forged and tested in war. A clear partnership framework is established early on with the creation of the Combined Chiefs of Staff Committee. Really important novel new mechanism. This brings together the joint service chiefs of each country, the military heads of their respective army, air and naval forces, and it gives the British Chiefs of Staff permanent representation in Washington, D.C., establishing a constant communication channel with their American counterparts. And the big strategic decisions concerning Overlord and D-Day are then taken by the Combined Chiefs of Staff at a series of major conferences throughout 1943, starting with Casablanca in January and culminating with Tehran in November. Those meetings were often very difficult, but they allow a common strategy to be hammered out. And central to that Allied cooperation was the principle adopted from early 1942 that British forces would serve under an American theatre commander and vice versa. Whichever country had the largest forces in the theatre would have the overall command. And Churchill and Roosevelt play a clear role in sponsoring and creating that framework. But of course, it's one thing to establish that structure, it's another to actually build the trust and allay the national suspicions and rivalries that make it work. And it's a bond that wasn't forged instantaneously. In 1942, Eisenhower was acutely aware that the whole basis of our higher organisation was new. Time and again during the summer, old army friends warned me that the conception of Allied unity, which we took as the foundation of our command scheme, was impractical and impossible. That any commander placed in my position was foredoomed to failure and could become nothing but a scapegoat to carry the odium of defeat for the whole operation. That was 1942. But by 1943, with North Africa cleared and the Allies poised to invade Sicily, Churchill was praising Eisenhower's leadership, and General Marshall was prepared to argue that the Germans' greatest discomfort now came not so much from their loss of troops as from the fact that the United States and Great Britain have worked so well as a team. And it was in North Africa in 1942 to 43 that the commanders for D-Day gained their first experience of working together. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, Ramsey, working together against a common enemy. And interestingly, the same enemy commander in General Erwin Rommel that they would face 1.5 years later in Normandy. That's the first precondition. Equally important, I would argue, is having command of the seas. Because without command of the seas, how are you going to bring your troops across the Atlantic? How are you going to supply them? In his own words, the only thing that ever really frightened Churchill during the Second World War was the U-boat peril. He said, "I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." And it's a battle that is expressed in figures. Allied merchant shipping losses in one column, number of German U-boats sunk in another, production numbers versus losses on both sides. And you can see how Churchill digested this information. He had a statistical unit established within 10 Downing Street that was responsible for taking all the information coming in and converting it into graphs and charts that were easily digestible by the Prime Minister. So these are the PowerPoint presentations of their day. And the message that these graphs were conveying about the loss of Allied merchant shipping in the Atlantic was unmistakable. And Churchill would later write, "How willingly would I have exchanged a full-scale attempted invasion for this shapeless, measureless peril expressed in charts, curves, and statistics." And it took the first half of 1943 to win the Battle of the Atlantic and to establish command of the seas. That is perhaps for another talk, but it was achieved by a combination of resources, tactics, technology, and intelligence. And Churchill uses the convening power of his office to bring together the relevant authorities in a new anti-U-boat committee that helps coordinate the British response across the various government departments. He orders the suspension of the Arctic convoys carrying much-needed supplies to Russia. He concentrates all British naval escorts in the Atlantic. Pressure is applied to speed up the delivery of Liberator aircraft with long-range capabilities which can close the gaps in air cover. New technology is employed. Shortwave radar, undetectable by the U-boats, allows British planes to detect enemy submarines on the surface. New forward-throwing anti-submarine mortars are introduced. And of course, what was not apparent at the time, nor allowed to be included in the early histories of the war, including Churchill's own, was the complementary role being played by intelligence. The change in British ciphers helped hide the convoys from the sharp eyes of the German codebreakers, while the British breaking of the German naval shark settings for U-boat traffic by the team of codebreakers at Bletchley Park is what helped guide the Royal Navy to their targets. And by May 1943, the situation in the Atlantic is in the process of being transformed. But again, it takes time. It also takes time to get mastery of the air, and that's just as important to the success of Overlord as command of the seas. In 1942, the British had pushed back against American plans for a more limited operation in France because they feared that continual engagement with the enemy above the continent would quickly eat up their fighter resources. And those fears had seemed justified by what happened at Dieppe. And Churchill is certainly clear that one of the essential preconditions for Overlord is that there must be a substantial reduction in the strength of the German fighter aircraft in northwest Europe before the assault takes place. And that involves increasing Allied production while reducing German capacity. A key factor is the relentless bombing of Germany by the Allies, a strategy that Churchill had endorsed from the moment he became Prime Minister, one of the few ways in which he was able to take the fight to the enemy in 1940-41. But again, this takes time. 1942 sees both the arrival of the American 8th Air Force in Britain and the appointment of the single-minded Air Marshal Arthur Harris as head of British Bomber Command. And Harris, of course, favours the area bombing of German cities and production centres, and he introduces larger and larger scale raids. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943 further increases that tempo, unleashing Operation Point Blank against German military and industrial targets. And with the Americans bombing Germany by day and the RAF bombing at night, the Luftwaffe are forced to divert more and more resources to the defence of the German homeland and therefore away from France. But as you hit the enemy, you've also got to build up your own men and materials. And the build-up of American and other national forces in Britain had started in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, but it had initially been small. The 34th American Division arrives in Northern Ireland in January 1942, followed by the first detachments of the United States 8th Air Force in southern England the following month. A year later, there are over 1,000 American aircraft in the country, many engaged in that bombing of Germany, but it's taken longer to assemble the ground forces. Operation Torch and the diversion of American troops to North Africa has meant that as late as early 1943, there is only one US division in the UK. Nor is it simply possible to transfer large numbers across the Atlantic without first putting in place in Britain the substantial infrastructure that's needed to sustain them. You need to build the depots, the bases, the marshalling yards, and so on. And this ties in, I think, with what Jack was talking about at this conference yesterday. It's not only about building the forces in the UK and building the infrastructure in the UK. It's actually about making sure that you've got the right levels of equipment to supply them with from the US. And this is where Knoxville plays its role. And as Jack pointed out yesterday, it took time to build up those factories, to build up that production capacity over here. Yet perhaps the real turning point of, well, actually, before I go on to that, just thinking of Jack's talk yesterday, you can see the barrage balloons here accompanying the D-Day force. It makes you wonder how many of those were actually built here in Tennessee. Yet perhaps the real turning tide of the war was one that Churchill himself chose largely to downplay in his Cold War era history of the Second World War. And that's the smashing of the German army on the Eastern Front in Russia in 1943. It's very noticeable that he devotes only 6 pages to the siege of Stalingrad in volume 4 of his war memoirs, and just 3 pages to the Battle of Kursk in volume 5. Yet those huge land battles, fought by enormous armies, far larger than those deployed by the British and Americans in North Africa or the Mediterranean, account for the vast majority of German combat losses. And by the autumn of 1943, the Red Army has pushed the Wehrmacht back hundreds of miles on a huge front and has retaken Kyiv in the Ukraine. So it's easy, I think, to see why Churchill might not want to focus attention on the scale of the Russian success. Much of the original rationale for attacking in France had been to relieve pressure on the Russians. Throughout 1942, he had remained acutely conscious that the Russians were still killing more Germans and destroying more equipment than the British and Americans put together. But by 1943, the nature of the Allied fear about the Soviet Union is changing. In 1942, their worry had been that the Russians might collapse, and that a limited intervention in France might be required as a last-ditch measure to divert German attention and help prop the Russians up. By the middle of 1943, the sheer scale of Soviet success on the battlefield has introduced a new element into Allied planning, namely the fear that Germany might collapse completely, leaving the Soviets in possession of most of the continent. And that was not the outcome that either Churchill or Roosevelt had gone to war for. Then you've got to have the ability to deliver the troops and their equipment onto the beaches. And that's an often overlooked factor in the success of D-Day. The final Overlord operation will involve a staggering 4,126 landing ships and craft, including 55 large infantry landing ships, 236 tank landing ships, 248 smaller infantry and 837 smaller tank landing craft, 502 assault craft, 464 craft for mechanised equipment, as well as a range of more specialised vessels. Those things don't appear overnight. It takes time to produce them, to assemble them in the right places, but also to recruit and train the crews and to develop the tactics and procedures for using them successfully. To actually time the landings onto the beaches, you've got to make sure actually that your heavier landing craft, including the tanks, move first, so that they actually then land on the beaches at the same time as the lighter landing craft containing the troops. Huge manuals of procedures have to be developed to actually coordinate an operation of this scale. And then there's the issue of morale. The Allied forces might have had an increasing advantage in terms of quantity and quality of arms, but prior to 1943, they'd yet to develop the ability and to cultivate the self-belief to use them effectively. Up until the Battle of El Alamein in November 1942, the British Army had not had a large-scale decisive victory against the Germans. Small wonder then that Churchill wanted to savour and celebrate that moment, ordering the ringing of the British church bells and proudly announcing at the annual Lord Mayor's luncheon in London's Mansion House that we have a victory, a remarkable and definite victory. The bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. American troops have to suffer their own baptism of fire at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, before they too gain an experience and become more battle-hardened. And Churchill was certainly a great believer in the value of high morale, and he maintained that battles were not won purely by arithmetical calculations of the strength of the opposing forces. And having put himself centre stage in 1940, becoming the main voice and image of the British war effort, Winston knew that he had a role to play in building and sustaining that confidence. So, in my view, it's all these factors taken together that contribute to the success of D-Day in 1944. And while we can never know what would have happened if an assault had been made earlier, I think what we can be sure of is that it would certainly have been more difficult. And I would argue that Churchill played a key role in ensuring that the essential preconditions were met. The pressures, of course, were immense, and Churchill, a man of action, disliked intensely the period of waiting and preparation immediately before the invasion. He's effectively responsible for putting the UK into a state of virtual lockdown. And I think after the last few years, we all know what that's like. But he had some really difficult political decisions to take in those last few moments. At what point do you lock down the southern coast of England? Because as soon as you do it, you're sending a signal that an invasion of France is perhaps imminent. At what point do you restrict, do you close the border with Ireland? At what point do you stop diplomatic communications between your ambassadors in the UK reporting back to their governments? These were all really tough decisions to take. And on the night before D-Day, he dines alone with his wife Clementine. And he tells her, "Do you realise that by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may have been killed?" And I don't think that's an arbitrary figure. I think he's thinking back to the First World War, and I think he's thinking back to the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where 20,000 British soldiers were killed. And I think, I'll just show you this. This is the letter that Clementine sends to him to try and sort of reassure him at this moment. "My darling, I feel so much for you at this agonising moment, so full of suspense, which prevents me from rejoicing about Rome." And she signs off with a little drawing of a cat. She would sign off her letters with a drawing of a cat. He would sign his to her with a drawing of a pig or pug. But here she is trying to sustain him at this key moment. And I think it would be wrong to think that this streak of pessimism was a lonely manifestation of Churchill's black dog. It wasn't. Again, strip away the layers of hindsight, and you see that it's shared by almost all the senior Allied commanders. Admiral Ramsay, often forgotten architect of the naval planning, Operation Neptune, wrote in his diary for the 5th of June 1944, "I'm under no delusions as to the risks involved in this most difficult of all operations, and the critical period around H hour when, if initial flights are held up, success will be in the balance." And Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the British Imperial General Staff, goes even further in his private journal for the same day, 5th of June, writing, "It's very hard to believe that in a few hours the cross-channel invasion starts. I'm very uneasy about the whole operation. At best it will fall so very, very far short of the expectations of the bulk of the people, namely all those who know nothing of its difficulties. At the worst, it may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war. I wish to God it were safely over." And even the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, after seizing that sort of opportunity provided by the lull in the weather, after giving that momentous order to go, retires to write and seal a letter to be opened in the event of failure that night, accepting personal responsibility upon withdrawing the troops from the beachheads. And as he later wrote in his memoirs, he knew that failure would carry with it consequences that would be almost fatal. Because the failure of Overlord would have meant the failure that everything that Churchill and Eisenhower and the others had worked for since 1941. It was a make or break moment, with all the eggs in one basket, and it's therefore not surprising that they were worried. But how did Churchill cope with that worry? Let's go back to the movie Churchill. Was he a gibbering wreck? Did he take it to his bed? What he actually decided to do was to try and accompany the invasion force across the Channel himself. And on the 16th of May, he asked Admiral Ramsay to draw up a plan. And that plan would have seen the British Prime Minister embarking on the battle cruiser HMS Belfast on D-1, which was, of course, originally scheduled for the 4th of June, and then transferring to a destroyer on D-Day itself for a short tour of the beaches if it was safe to do so. Now, Admiral Ramsay does this. Churchill's given him an order. He has to produce the plan. But he does so extremely reluctantly. Churchill won't let Ramsay tell the British First Sea Lord, the head of the Navy. But Ramsay says he has to tell Eisenhower because Eisenhower is his immediate superior. And the last thing that Ramsay or Eisenhower, any of the British military leaders want is Churchill anywhere near the action on D-Day. It's going to be a huge added burden, a huge distraction, and it's quite clearly not where he should be, because if there are major political decisions to be taken, he's not going to be able to take them on the deck of a battlecruiser. Eisenhower tries to talk Churchill out of it, but Churchill points out to Eisenhower that Eisenhower has no control over the complement of a Royal Naval ship, and therefore, as Churchill appoints himself to the crew, there's nothing that Eisenhower can do about it. In fact, there's only one person constitutionally who can stop Churchill from going, and that's the King, George VI. At an audience with the King, the King asks Churchill, actually, where Churchill intends to be on D-Day. And Churchill says, well, I want to go over and see the action for myself. At which point the King says, that's a wonderful idea. I want to go too. And you can imagine the horror of their entourages, particularly the King's private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, Tommy Lascelles, for those of you who watched The Crown. And it falls on Alan Lascelles to tell the King that actually there's no way he can go constitutionally, and that Sir Alan Lascelles is not going to accept responsibility for telling Princess Elizabeth that she's just become Queen if the ship goes down. Not only that, but the King has to tell Churchill that Churchill can't go. And so we have in the archive the letter which King George VI writes to Churchill on the 31st of May 1944. My dear Winston, I've been thinking a great deal of our conversation yesterday, and I've come to the conclusion that it would not be right for either you or I to be where we plan to be on D-Day. I don't think I need emphasise what it would mean to me personally and to the whole Allied cause if at this juncture a chance bomb, torpedo, or even a mine should remove you from the scene. Equally, a change of sovereign at this moment would be a serious matter for the country and empire. What does Churchill do? Well, actually, Churchill ignores this letter, and he goes off to the south coast. He takes his railway carriage down to the south coast. He parks it in a siding in the sort of rural Hampshire village of Droxford, as close as he can get to Eisenhower's headquarters. And at this point, he's still trying to see if he can go further. And it takes a second letter from the King, written as late as the 2nd of June 1944, before Churchill grudgingly concedes to His Majesty's wishes and indeed commands. And even then he protests that I ought to be allowed to go where I consider it necessary to the discharge of my duty. And later he reflects that a man who has to play an effective part in taking with the highest responsibility grave and terrible decisions of war may need the refreshment of adventure. He may need also the comfort that when sending so many others to their death, he may share in a small way their risks. And I think what you see here is that Churchill needs the release of action. Of course, he's finally able to inspect the Normandy beachhead on D-Day +6, the 12th of June. So, to bring all of this to conclusion, what General Lord Dannatt and I have aimed to do in the book Churchill's D-Day is to put Churchill's decisions and actions in context and to show the many factors and individuals that colour his approach to this critical operation. To come back to the beginning of my talk, yes, he was undoubtedly influenced by the First World War and by a desire to avoid a repeat of the huge bloodshed of the trench stalemate in France, because that would have been catastrophic for the country and almost certainly fatal to his own administration. And yes, he was determined to preserve the British Empire. Any British Prime Minister in 1944 would have been forced to think about the defence of Egypt, Malta, Palestine, and of routes to Canada, India, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. But Churchill was particularly driven by a desire not to preside over the empire's liquidation, and his Mediterranean and Balkan policies both had a clear imperial and anti-Soviet dimension. He was becoming increasingly worried about the Soviet domination of the Balkans, and he has to think about the post-war situation in a way that Marshall, Montgomery, Eisenhower as the military commanders don't. And the pending post-war settlement is certainly a factor in Churchill's desire to keep fighting in other theatres, especially Italy, even after the final decision has been taken to attack in northwest France. And it explains why at times he did talk about and resent the tyranny of overlord. Yet for all of that, he told his friend, the South African leader, General Smuts, that he regarded the relationship with the United States and the commitment to overlord as the keystone arch of Anglo-American cooperation. All the major decisions were discussed with Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff, and they were taken for sound strategic reasons. Operations in North Africa and Sicily took on their own momentum, and they further delayed D-Day. But they were launched, I would argue, because the preconditions for an assault on Normandy had not yet been met, because the risks of a frontal assault in France were deemed too high, and because to do nothing while preparing to attack France was politically and militarily unacceptable. The Battle of the Atlantic had to be won, mastery of the skies had to be obtained, your enemy had to be isolated and weakened. On D-Day itself, Churchill, in spite of his best efforts to get himself a front row seat on board a British ship, had to wait for news of the battle in London. There's no doubt that the build-up to that launch was a particularly stressful time for him. He didn't have the same reserves of energy as 1940. But he was not a nervous wreck, as the movie Churchill seeks to portray him. The weeks leading up to Overlord see him taking an active interest in all aspects of the operation, using his convening power to ensure that production targets were being met, for the artificial harbours, the mulberries and gooseberries, for the landing craft. He's making sure that the deception plans are in place, that the security is being maintained. And though often portrayed as a warmonger, one of Winston's consistent concerns in cabinet meetings and defence committee meetings immediately prior to the invasion was to minimise Allied military and French civilian casualties. Yes, he drives the War Cabinet and the Chiefs of Staff to distraction, challenging them on the number of vehicles landing on the beachheads versus men, railing against the machinations of de Gaulle, opposing plans to bomb French railway marshalling yards because of the risk of high civilian casualties. But he does so out of a concern to reduce losses and ensure success. And surely that's his job. So, quoting Samuel Johnson, Churchill would later write that courage was the greatest of the virtues because it guaranteed all of the others. And of course, it took incredible courage to wade ashore under gunfire on D-Day, or to fly in those bomber missions over Germany. And as was said yesterday, almost everyone in this room will have stories within their family of incredible personal courage. But I think it also took courage to lead. And that, of course, is what Churchill and Eisenhower and Roosevelt, this is what they had to do. And that courage, I think, was ultimately recognised by the state of Tennessee in February 1963, when they passed a resolution to make Sir Winston Churchill an honorary citizen of that state. But to quote Lucille's father, who served with the OSS, enough of this British lovemaking. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we've got time for just a few questions, if there are any. Gentleman over there.
Yes, sir. This was great. Operation Dragoon. All the reasons you spoke of about D-Day. You say the same about Dragoon.
Operation Dragoon, for those who don't know, is going into the south of France. And it's an operation then to come up through the south of France to support the landings taking place in Normandy. The initial conception for Dragoon, which I think was originally codenamed Anvil, was that it would go in at the same time as the D-Day landings. You'd be having this sort of simultaneous assault. But when Eisenhower and Montgomery sort of looked in details at the plans for D-Day itself, they decided that wasn't tenable, and therefore You would go in Normandy first, and then you would go into the south of France. At that point, Churchill becomes very opposed to the plans for Dragoon because he sees them as diverting troops away from Italy. He wants the advance in Italy to continue. That theatre is under a British commander, General Alexander. From Churchill's perspective, there are British laurels to be won there. He's already concerned that the Normandy landings have this sort of primacy now and are pulling all of the resources into that theatre. He wants to keep going in Italy as well. Dragoon, to him, is a further dilution of Italy. And he also, I think, fails to appreciate how it will support the Normandy landings. And I think it's partly because he doesn't appreciate fully the speed in which actually you're going to be able to get the troops from the south of France up to support the forces of Normandy. So he opposes the landing, but in fact on that he's wrong, I think, and the Dragoon landing goes in virtually unopposed and does play a key role in supporting the landings in the north, and it's the subject of a huge row between Churchill and Eisenhower, probably the biggest row that they have. And ultimately, I think, looking back on it, again, with the benefit of hindsight, you have to say that Eisenhower was right. Okay, other questions? Lady over here.
Thinking that we study history to prepare for the future or even the present, would you be willing to compare Churchill's position with Netanyahu's position?
I have to be very, very careful on these subjects because I think I remember standing alongside Winston Churchill's daughter Mary on occasions like this, and she would always countenance sort of caution in trying to predict what her father would say in terms of any contemporary situation. And I think that has to be right in the sense that, you know, he was hard enough to predict in his lifetime without trying to predict what he would do now. And I think the closest that you can get to that is to say, what are the underlying principles that Churchill would adopt? And I think one of the clear underlying principles would have been wanting to stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States. And that alliance with the United States becomes more and more key to him. Churchill believed, I think, that Britain derived its power and its prestige in the world from sitting at the focal point of three overlapping circles. And he sets this out as early as 1930 in an article called The United States of Europe. And those three circles are Europe, the Empire and Commonwealth, and the wider English-speaking world, which comes to mean the United States. And the problem you have if you're Churchill is that as you move through the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, the comparative weight of those circles shifts. And by the time you get to the end of his life, the empire is disappearing. Europe is in ruins and divided, with the Soviet Union dominating half of it. And so the American circle becomes paramount. And when he leaves office for the last time in 1955, one of his parting words to the British cabinet are, effectively, don't forget the Americans, which you can argue Eden does almost immediately with the Suez Crisis. But I think the underlying principles would have been to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. Would he have been horrified by the terrorism in Israel last October? Of course he would. Would he have wanted to a robust response to that? Probably, but it's very difficult. You know, he's operating in a different context to say, exactly, what line he would have taken. And if you're looking at the D-Day book, certainly in the immediate run-up to D-Day, he is incredibly concerned about civilian casualties. So I think he would have been looking very closely at any military plans. But to predict exactly what he would have done, I think, is very hard. I mean, I think he would have been standing with the West. He would have been certainly offering strong verbal support to Israel, standing with the United States. But I don't think you can go any further than that.